Alright, in this lecture we're going to be talking about the reign and administration of Napoleon Bonaparte and his impact on the French state, kind of the last gasp, you might say, of the French Revolution, and how his ascendancy actually marked the end of the French Revolution. We'll also look at his impact on the European continent as well, and as a result, his impact on history and world history. Um, you remember from last time that we had left off talking about in the second phase of the French Revolution, Robespierre had taken control of the Committee on Public Safety, ran roughshod through the Reign of Terror, and how by the end of that period, the cooler heads began to really prevail. Moderates reasserted themselves, and the National Convention began to curtail the influence of the Committee on Public Safety as a whole. They sought to protection from the Parisian mob, basically putting down the mob, bringing it in line essentially. They reopened churches as well. They reestablished freedom of religion in February of 1795. They also practiced laissez-faire economic policies and put those in place to scale back the heavy regulation and price fixing that had occurred, especially in the periods of national emergency. This also saw the institution of a new constitution that took place, was drafted and ratified in August of 1795. It created a bicameral legislature. The lower house was called the Council of 500. The upper house was called the Council of Elders. So all of these actions really intended to tamp out the flames of impassioned revolution really met with rather limited success. They had succeeded in alienating the Parisian mob thoroughly, and they had created an opportunity for political power to be consolidated into a central figure, almost akin to the reestablishing of a monarchical-like figure. And Napoleon Bonaparte seized that opportunity. In the what was known as the Thermidorian reaction, and this was named after the month in the new French calendar, marked a time when France and its people began to set really this more moderate course in politics. There was a new institution called the Directory, which was a committee or panel of 5 individuals that were chosen by the Council of Elders from a list of nominations put forth by the Council of 500. In October of 1795, Parisians really worried about their place in the new government, that there wasn't a whole lot of room for public sentiment to be represented in the new mechanisms of government. And they rose up in revolt as a result of that. And this is kind of their main go-to, essentially, as they had protested on many other occasions. The new government, in response to this new public kind of mass uprising, relied on the army to crush the mob, as it had in the past, and was this contingency was this detachment of troops was commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte. In this period of the French Revolution, it was marked by corruption, graft, stagnation, and this all fed into kind of this mass resentment and disillusionment with not just government but all aspects of French life and standard of living. There was also another hurdle that was to be faced, and that was that the new government couldn't really bridge the divide between counter revolutionaries on the right and revolutionaries on the left. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup d'etat. This effectively ended the revolutionary period in France, but interestingly, at the same time, Napoleon could present himself as a product of the revolution, so that he really became this tyrant ruling in the interests of the people. As for background, Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769. He was born on the island of Corsica, which had been annexed by France by that time. He was descended from Florentine nobility. His father was a lawyer, so he's coming from a pretty bourgeois household. He's rather learned himself. And in 1785, Napoleon was commissioned as a lieutenant in the French army. He was ostracized by and large by his fellow officers. They viewed him as an outsider. They mocked him for being short. He spoke French with an Italian accent, and he was not particularly wealthy. He was not coming from aristocracy. But he was a talented tactician and military officer as well. And in 1792, he became a captain. 2 years later, in 1794, he became a brigadier general. And this came after he demonstrated his skills as an artillery commander in battles defending France. And this is all by the age of 25 years old for the young Napoleon. In 1795, he saved the National Convention from a Parisian mob in October of that year. And as a result, in 1796, he was made commander of the French army in Italy, in northern Italy. He won numerous battles there, and he also won over the loyalty of his troops under his command and turned them really into a crack fighting force. In 1797, he succeeded in defeating the Austrian forces that had marched into northern Italy and had successfully negotiated a peace on behalf of France itself. He returned to France to take command of the French forces that were training and preparing to invade England. Napoleon managed to convince his superiors that this invasion was ill-advised, and instead he called for an invasion of Egypt. This was an effort to disrupt and threaten British access to its global empire, and specifically its access to India, the kind of most cherished prize within the British imperial expanse or territory. In 1799, Napoleon and his army became bogged down actually in Egypt. British managed to, with their superior navy, managed to cut off supplies to the French army and to Napoleon's troops. And so as a result, Napoleon had to abandon his army and return to France. And it was at that time that he took part in this coup d'etat, which ushered in what's known as the Napoleonic Era. This coup brought yet another constitution into effect. The legislature here was elected indirectly, uh, and political power rested in Article 42 of the new French Constitution, where executive authority specifically lay in the hands of three consuls. But as a provision, as Article 42 states, the decision of the first consul shall suffice in matters of state decision making. That first consul, the individual bearing that title, was Napoleon, and he controlled, therefore, the executive branch of government in France. And this provided him with the legitimacy he needed in order to govern alone. So it has kind of very dictatorial qualities to it. He had influence over the legislature. He appointed government officials. He commanded the armed forces, and he also conducted foreign affairs. So he had an enormous amount of authority and influence over directing the ship of state in French, in the French Republic, in the French government. By 1801, Napoleon had reconciled with the church, which had been one of the staunchest opponents to the French Revolution throughout this period that we've covered extensively. Napoleon and Pope Pius the Seventh agreed that the French government would nominate French bishops, but the Pope could remove them from office for any reason. The church land that had been seized during the Revolution would not be returned to or compensated to the church. Catholicism was recognized as the majority religion in France, but there was never to be or not to be a state religion that was officially proclaimed. And all clergy would be paid by the state. So there's a clear deference being paid here to the French state itself. The Pope's agreement to all of this gave official recognition to, or recognition of, and to the French Revolution itself. This concordat, or agreement, ended also the animosities between the revolutionaries and the church, as mentioned earlier. Napoleon also repaired relations with the church in order to combat a new second coalition that had allied once again against France. This included powers such as Britain, Russia, and Austria in particular, and that they had all declared war against France. The idea here being that he didn't want to have the church, the Catholic Church, the Pope in Rome, to have any excuse as far as why Catholics in the rest of Europe should align themselves against fellow Catholics in France. So Napoleon here is really acting as a rationalist. He considered religion to be a tool for winning legitimacy and power, as he did with most things throughout his life. As a couple examples, he proclaimed himself a Catholic in France, but he also proclaimed himself a Muslim when he was on campaign in Egypt. So he's very opportunistic here as far as his relationship with faith. He saw religion essentially as playing a morally important role in society, but as far as a political instrument, it was to be more opportunistic. By 1802, Napoleon became consul for life, as stated in the Peace of Amiens in that year, 1802. This peace also helped to provide a temporary reprieve to France's war with this second coalition that was had established itself in opposition to France. It gave also Napoleon time to consolidate his authority um, at home for a very short period of time. Um, it gave France new frontiers as well, and client states from stretching from the North Sea to the Adriatic Sea. By 1803, this fragile peace that had been established collapsed, and adversaries were back at war with France, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Before doing so, I just wanted to um, mention and kind of investigate and talk a bit about the French state and the French bureaucracy under Napoleon's reign. So Napoleon here reconfigured the bureaucracy of the government by having the national government itself appoint new administrators. This was something that was new. It had lapsed to a considerable degree during the course of the revolution, had not been practiced essentially. Provinces and local governments were really kind of left to their own devices, and had been given greater autonomy in order to meet their own local affairs and kind of set policies for themselves. Here, under Napoleon's rule, with a internal stability kind of being reestablished, there was a greater realignment of and kind of gravitation of political power back to the national levels of government and the bureaucracy that could begin to administer or pass policies and legislation to oversee local matters. So by having local administrators be chosen by the central government, these bureaucrats were then beholden to the central government for their pay, for careers, and also for professional advancement. Tax collection also became much more efficient. Their professional collectors were given authority, the authority necessary to do their jobs. So this cut down, it basically eradicated corruption and graft, and also restocked the public coffers with the monies necessary to make the French state solvent once again. Tax collections, or excuse me, tax exemptions had been almost entirely eliminated, and Napoleon made it a chief concern of his to crack down on any kind of loopholes as never before. And by 1802, he proclaimed a balanced budget. This following just on the heels of his coup d'etat just years prior, where the state was on the verge of bankruptcy and fiscal and financial collapse. The bureaucracy again here was founded on a merit-based system. That characteristic kind of carried through from the earlier revolutionary periods, and this meant that those successful demonstrations of ability were rewarded with promotion. So that was highly beneficial to the functioning of the French state, and it actually gave them an advantage over their competitors in the rest of Europe that practiced these very kind of antiquated techniques or had a very influential nobility and aristocracy that would take almost hand down bureaucratic offices within families, generation after generation. And so therefore you may not be getting the best talent to organize and make the state function at its highest levels of efficiency. In France, with a merit-based system, that was the main driving factor, and it made the state much more efficient, but also robust. Simultaneously with all this going on, Napoleon reconstituted the aristocratic class within France. Between 1808 and 1814, he had created a new population of nobles, basically creating 3,263 new nobles. 60% of these came from the ranks of the military officer corps. Others came from upper ranks of the civil service, and most were from the bourgeoisie, the kind of middle class within the French society. So you can see that there's a close association here between, government officials, military officials, that are kind of getting the nod from Napoleon, who was going to, kind of again create these this elite core of nobility that he handpicked, essentially. Napoleon also went on to create a legal code, basically boiling it down to its core essence. So again, it was much more efficient. It was much more streamlined in its basically not only the boiling down of the code itself, so that the laws were less conflicted, but they were also more streamlined and easier to execute, essentially. This effort to streamline the legal code was a long one. Prior to the revolution, France had some 300 or so different sets of laws on the books. Revolutionaries had tried to, in the first two phases, had tried to make the code more efficient, kind of trying to do what Napoleon actually succeeded in accomplishing. But Napoleon was the one really that made the biggest and most substantial strides. He consolidated the body of laws into 7 codes, and this is what's known as the Code Napoleon. This civil code was really the most significant contribution, perhaps, that Napoleon made, because it could be, as French influence spread across the continent of Europe, these kind of legal ideas, jurisprudence, and also kind of presenting a unified codification of laws was very appealing. It was also kind of inspiring. It preserved, the Code Napoleon really preserved the revolution's core principles, and this was a dedication to equality of all citizens before the law. Individuals had rights to choose their own profession, choose their or practice their own religion. So there's a degree of tolerance and freedom when it comes to religious observances. There would be an abolition of serfdom and feudalism. Property rights were to be protected. Trade unions and strikes were outlawed. This was done to protect employers, but it was also to promote domestic tranquility during wartime as well. And so all of these ideas and the ideology behind them, and embedded within the Code Napoleon, within this legal structure itself, all went to spread wherever these French armies roamed across, again, the heart of Western Europe and throughout the continent. Now, Having said all that, it's important to understand that in actuality, in certain circumstances, not everyone's rights were safeguarded. And one particular demographic that was absent, not represented, and actually suffered a retreat as far as their legal rights were concerned were women. Women's rights retreated from their previous Revolutionary Era gains. Divorce became more difficult. Women could be imprisoned for committing adultery, and this could be confirmed by their husbands simply by through their husbands urging in some cases. Women's property became that of their husbands when they entered into the institution of marriage. Women were also treated as minors when it came to their participation in lawsuits. So their testimony was seen in the eyes of the courts as being less reliable than a man's. As for Napoleon's imperial exploits and expansion, we could see from early on in 1805 to 1807, Napoleon's going to proceed to dismantle the European coalition that opposed him. In victory after victory in the battles of Ulm, Austerlitz, Jena, and Eylau, this helped Napoleon establish a new European order in which he basically tried to again advance French, the French approach to governance and transplant it here across Europe. These exploits were largely funded by Napoleon's successful sale of the Louisiana Territory to the United States in 1804. So the United States got the Louisiana Territory, which basically was, it doubled the size of the United States as a territorial entity. It gave them essentially the middle third of what is the United States today, some 828,000 square miles of territory. And this was all for the price of $15 million, which the Thomas Jefferson's administration agreed to. With that money, Napoleon was able to field a massive, well-equipped army and establish what became known as his Grand Empire. He consolidated his control over the continent of Europe. France came to rule over Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, and much of Italy. And he ruled over these areas directly. The French did. Allies, those that allied themselves with the French, included the likes of Prussia, Russia, and Austria as well. So for this brief period, really Napoleon stood alone as far as the continental power in Europe. Really, it was Britain alone that stood as the most significant power in Europe on their tiny island nation that managed to keep Napoleon in check somewhat. So with the consolidation of power on the mainland, on the continent of Europe itself, this provided Napoleon and revolutionary France with the opportunity to spread, as I mentioned, these ideals across the continent. The Code Napoleon, equal opportunity for public servants based on merit, not on heredity, equality before the law, and also religious tolerance. So his dominance again on the continent was unrivaled, but it did remain landlocked. Why? Well, Britain was the naval power of the world during this period of time. So the control of the seas was relegated to Britain and Britain alone. this was further confirmed with the Britain's defeat of the Spanish and French navies and naval forces at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. So as long as Britain commanded the seas, they could keep Napoleon and his armies landlocked, and that they could not, really expand beyond Europe itself. Napoleon, in response to this, implemented what was known as his continental system. This lasted from about 1806 to 1807. It was essentially an attempt to prevent British goods from coming to mainland Europe, to prevent them from finding any buyers in the European continent. The idea, the theory behind this was that this would make the British suffer economically because they would be able to get goods from around their global empire, manufacture them in England, but then they would not be able to have any, wouldn't be able to distribute them to market for sale. This would hopefully mean that Britain's economy would tank, it would weaken the British state, and in preparation for eventual invasion by Napoleon's forces. It was kind of a long shot to begin with, and quickly the continental system became a failure. Napoleon actually had to abandon hopes once again of invading England. Britain was just too economically resilient. It found other outlets for its manufactured goods to sell around the world. Also, the French Navy could never match the quantity of the British Navy, and also could never match the output of new warships that the Britain was able to achieve. So this British persistence helped undermine Napoleon's Grand Empire. It aided national movements. Britain aided national movements on the continent of Europe, those that wished to challenge Napoleon's authority. One of the best places where this really was quite successful was in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain itself. British forces linked up with Spanish nationalist forces and managed to frustrate the efforts of a 200,000 man French army that was deployed in the Iberian Peninsula, specifically charged with the task of putting down this insurrection. So these nationalist sentiments existed all over Europe. I mean, there were those that kind of couldn't stand Napoleon's authority, and this really was, you could say, an unintended influence of the French Revolution itself. That the French Revolution had wrapped itself in this fever pitch of nationalist sentiment, that France, a sacrifice needed to be made for the French state to thrive. Well, people around Europe, non-French people around Europe, simply took that same sentiment and used it to fuel the desire, the flames of their own sense of nationalist identity, tied to their own states. So Europeans didn't buy into French nationalism necessarily, but under French rule they realized the power of this nationalist fervor and began to clamor for their own. By 1812, Russia had dropped out of the continental system, and Napoleon realized that he really couldn't let this stand. It he feared the message it would send to other allies, first and foremost, that it would undermine French rule, and also it would undermine the very existence of the continental system itself, which was kind of a zero-sum proposition, that the loss of one piece meant that the whole system would collapse. So it couldn't be tolerated that France decided just to kind of opt out. That was not an option. That just couldn't be tolerated. So in June of 1812, Napoleon set out with an army of some 600,000 troops of his Grand Armée, and proceeded to march across Europe and invade Russia. His battle plan was pretty simple here. He would engage Russian forces, destroy them, and reinstall a French-friendly regime in Moscow and bring them back into the continental system by force. Russian forces responded by refusing to meet the French in open battle, in a pitched kind of engagement. Instead, they resorted to scorched earth tactics, destroying anything that the Russians themselves could either consume or relocate, keeping it out of the hands essentially of Napoleon and his French army. All the while, they retreated. The Russians just sacrificed territory. They retreated back towards Moscow, basically buying time for themselves. At the Battle of Borodino, just outside of Moscow, the French finally caught up to the Russians. But the French victory here was indecisive at best, and it was quite costly for the French forces. Once the French proceeded to make it to Moscow itself, the city was ablaze, torched like so many other Russian towns and villages that the French had passed on their way into the heart of Russia itself. Without food or supplies, Napoleon really had no choice but to abandon his invasion of Russia, to abandon his occupation of Moscow. And this is what began what was known as the Great Retreat, in which Napoleon and his Grand Army began to move back towards Poland. This occurred just as winter was setting in within Russia itself. And so, as a result, the Grand Army suffered terribly. It was poorly provisioned. It was, had made all these sacrifices just to get into Russia, to invade Russia, and now it was having to retreat. And of the 600,000 man army that set out in June, only 40,000 or so returned to Poland by January of 1813. So Napoleon's army was effectively just devastated. Napoleon's worst fears came true. Rebellions erupted all across the Grand Empire, and by April 1814, Napoleon was forced to surrender. The heads of Europe, the kind of representing the great powers of Europe, banished Napoleon to the island of Elba, just off the coast of Tuscany. They reinstalled France with a monarchical ruler that was Louis XVIII, the brother of Louis the executed Louis XVI, and they reinstalled. They succeeded in reinstalling Louis XVIII as the head of the French state, but you can imagine that the French population, the French citizenry, was not necessarily enthusiastic about this new leadership. So they really didn't support Louis the 18th at all. Compounding this was the fact that Napoleon escaped and managed to return to France, and the French troops that were sent out to stop him actually ended up defecting to his side and joining him at his side in his triumphal march back to Paris to reclaim power once again. This occurred in the spring of 1815, March 20th of 1815. Napoleon had succeeded in returning to Paris, reassuming control of government, and in June of 1815, a combined French and Prussian force led by the British Duke of Wellington met the French army and Napoleon, who was commanding in person, in Brussels at the Battle of Waterloo. This was a one-day battle in which Napoleon was thoroughly defeated. As a result of that, the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled this time to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he spent the rest of his life. So to wrap things up here, the French Revolution in its entirety certainly had its limitations, but its most profound significance was that, again, it served as a model for liberal revolutions all around the world, whether they be nationalist, social revolutions, anti-colonial revolutions. They all, in many respects, would cite the French Revolution, the principles, the kind of ideology of the French Revolution as an inspiring source. It proved the French Revolution also proved that the masses could topple the most entrenched regimes and institutions, the oldest and most renowned of institutions in these established powers of Europe. One of these greatest powers, France itself, helped inspire mass nationalism, and self-awareness, not just self-awareness among a portion of the population of France, but really tapping into all social ranks of France, mobilizing the ideological sentiment and kind of buy-in that everybody felt that they were doing their part for their nation. This was thanks in part to, and also in spite of, Napoleon's relentless ambition. It was kind of he was both a product of this kind of mentality, and he was also kind of an author of its own, in a sense, its own kind of destruction as well. That on the one hand, he is one of these merit-based generals coming to power. He was an accomplished wartime leader as far as his ability to command troops. He was an effective political leader, but the problem was that he was a dictator. He was anti-democratic. He was anti-republican in his mindset as far as the functions of state. So he embodied kind of revolutionary senses of kind of empowerment, but he used that sense to quash and act as a counter-revolutionary in many respects, putting down kind of mass expressions of either discontent or any challenge to his authority, um, which is kind of anti-revolutionary in sentiment. He wanted to distance the functions of state from mass participation, and suffrage, as far as being represented, having the people represented directly within their own government. So this is what France would continue to struggle with after 1815. It's also what Europe and much of the rest of the world would continue to struggle with after 1815 as well. Instead, attention began to shift to other factors like this increasing industrialization that was taking place, and the social and economic upheaval that events and kind of succeeding waves of technological advancement would continually kind of churn up in various populations, and the responses that would have to be kind of created in order to meet expectations and kind of appease people's either apprehensions or frustrations with having to deal with this constant kind of industrial change. So this kind of gets us to the 1815. It gets us to this period of what's known as the Long Peace, a prolonged period, almost about a century, of relative peace and stability across and throughout much of the European continent, the European world. Um, there will be some exceptions to that, of course, but by and large, the major powers of Europe were buying into a negotiated balance of power, which we'll talk about in future lectures as we continue to move forward. So the next installment here will focus on what's happening in the Americas, both South and North America specifically, and then from there that'll get us in the Western Hemisphere up to about the year 1900, before we begin to turn attention to Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and Asia as well, so that we're kind of all reaching the 20th century roughly at about the same period of time, chronologically. So I will talk to you then. Take care.